Hi, nice to meet you all. I'm not going to use the screen. I think Paulo Coelho said PowerPoint is for people that have no power and no point. But actually, it's because I don't have a connector. But also, it doesn't really matter. I wasn't intending to. So great to meet you all. Viðar has been telling me a lot about these courses and trying to get me involved. But July, August has been kind of a holy time for me of not putting anything on my plans. So I was up north where my grandfather's farm is just below the Arctic Circle. Actually, on some maps, it goes through the farm. I'm not sure why. Sometimes it crosses, but I think it's just above the farm, and it's one of the northernmost farms in Iceland. And that's where my grandfather was born. And when he was in his, and then the farm was abandoned during the herring boom. And it was kind of both the war and the herring boom kind of depopulated so many of these farms that were considered actually very good places to live. I just took a picture of it's called Hlunndabók. It's what's Hlunnd in English?
It's a difficult word to translate. It's
benefits.
Resources.
Yeah,
natural resources on a farm or in an area.
Yeah, it's also like more like extra resources because it's not about the typical grazing areas. It's more like, so it almost fills all the X's in the book of resources. That is, and that's why it was considered a very good place to live. In the old economy, it had driftwood, eiderdown, seals, fisheries, trout, motekja. Yeah, so it had like a peat. And my grandfather, he was raised there, and they used to. How was it? He said he ate everything that could fly, run, or swim, except humans. But we were never sure. And so then the farm is abandoned in the 40s, and in the 60s it's basically almost becoming a ruin, the old farm. But then he decides to. In his 50s, he quits he decides not to have like a permanent job, but more like he wants to have like 4 months off every year. So he starts renovating the farm and with his siblings and just lives there from May to September, fishing and shooting seagulls and collecting eiderdown. And then the family starts coming there every summer, and it actually becomes like the identity of his siblings and his grandchildren. So we were there now with my father, 2 of my father's sisters, and like 20 of their children and grandchildren, and everybody in a pile. And so the pile system has been very important because many families that have a farm like this, they have like weeks and weeks. So my part of the family has 1 week, another part has another week. But with us, it's more like when somebody knows somebody will be there, then more people want to be there, and that's why my children are good friends with children of my nieces and nephews. So it's about 100 people that share the place, and it's like and the name Dreamland, my book Dreamland, comes from there because the poet that wrote the poem Dreamland, that then became a song that was kind of their anthem, the anthem of my grandparents. And this for me has often been like a valuable insight into kind of the dramatic change basically of the 20th century. That is how grandfather, that is to be so close to somebody that is basically born on a, what do you call it, bartering society, like grandmother telling me when she saw money for the first time, you know, and she saw money, and she took scissors and she was going to cut out the man. Like, I think it was some king on a Danish bill or something, and she was going to cut out the man and put it in her scrapbook. But then he said, no, it's money. It's and basically their eating traditions and their livelihoods, and how dramatically it has changed into this Anthropocene, into the time that we're now in. And you can almost see it yourself also, just like I remember when we were traveling north for the first times, and Akureyri, which is a town close by, Akureyri was almost like a different world also. So it was like Akureyri had all its own logos for everything, its own trademarks, its own milk, its own butter, its own shoes, its own chocolate, its own cola drinks. So things that were not available anywhere else than Akureyri. So it's almost like coming abroad to go to Akureyri. And then of course when you went abroad, you saw something very different. But now you see how things have been like globalized and changed. So I often use kind of these reference points just to kind of adjust and observe and understand. So also you could see the self-sufficiency of these cultures, like the strong culture of kind of the local culture of literature, and the things that Veda has probably been telling you about, like local people that were translating Strindberg or something, you know, like in a very poor farm, or the literature that took place on the next farm, where actually I think my family are the villains, but in Jón Trausti's book, yeah. So I start writing when I'm maybe in my 20s, and one of my first books is a book of poetry, and that was just like a random poems. But my next book was a book. I was thinking of what is the role of poetry, and if you look at the old times, you would have poems about everything. Like you would see a farm, like the farm up north, and basically any farm around, you don't notice it maybe if you come from abroad or if you're not from that place. But actually most of these places are covered with a thick layer of literature. It can be up to 2.3 meters thick, you know, where it's thickest. So you'll have the documents of the settlers, the Landnámabók. You'll have documents of the disputes in the saga, with the saga characters, and you'll have the same farm names that are at the same places since then. So then you'll have the saga characters, and then you'll have maybe the Sturlunga sagas, and then you'll have various accounts from later history, and then you'll have folklore, and then you might have had poets, and probably would have had poets living on a farm. So you would have every mountain, every place saturated with some kind of history. You know, the hidden people, the monsters in the lake, like the Nikur, the horse that lived in the lakes, and the trolls, of course, the rocks that had a story behind them because they became. So I was very influenced by how actually literature saturates places and makes them actually quite habitable by saturating them. And then when you look into the more modern times, like when romanticism comes in, suddenly new things come into the poetry, like the golden plover becomes like a symbol of spring and hope and God, and it becomes so powerful in the poet's words that we haven't eaten golden plovers since 1840 or something, because you're eating hope in God and you don't do that. And then like when Reykjavik is emerging and it's considered like the disgusting kind of sewer of Iceland, it's called the gravel. You move from beautiful places like this, and almost all poetry was about the paradise lost. You know, I was young, I was walking by the creek, I was innocent, but now I have tuberculosis in Reykjavik. And you know, so it was all about that, and it was like full of social problems and poverty, and then Thomas Guðmundsson, this poet, comes and starts writing poems about places that nobody had written about, because many of these streets were, of course, quite new. They hadn't existed a few years before. So he makes a poem like it might be beautiful in China, but there's nothing like strolling with your lover in the west end of Reykjavik, you know. So he lifts that place and takes it from the gravel and creates other aspects. And the coal crane is like a sphinx, and even the rats by the rats in the harbor are included, and it just changes Reykjavik. And lava, for example, lava was considered a nuisance. Lava was not something; it was not an asset. Lava was not in the book of Hlunnindi. It was unfertile. It was difficult to navigate. It broke the bones of your animals. It was just, and we would have poems like this. Jón Trausti, the guy that was born on the farm next to my grandfather, he wrote this poem like, I will love my country, and blah, 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 you know, like these national phrases. And then like you would say, þessi hraun eru, I don't remember, I'm switching languages. These lava fields are wounds that we are meant to heal. That is their thing is to level out the lava fields and turn them into fertile land. You know, that's the work ahead. The wounds that they're meant to heal. But then Kjarval comes. I don't know if you know Kjarval. He's kind of the most famous Icelandic painter of the 20th century, and he does not look above the lava fields. He looks like at the mountains in the distance, but he looks straight at the lava, and he would make like, you know, 3-4 square meter paintings of lava, just like blasted up. Something that nobody actually noticed, and everybody took. It was there, but nobody really saw it. But when he kind of blasted it up and it went on the walls of the homes of the well-doing people, and also was printed for the common people in replicas, we started to see lava differently, and we started to see Iceland in a different way. Instead of seeing Iceland as a lack or absence of trees or a degraded land because of an eruption, we started to just acknowledge it and take it as it is. And now many people just see lava as like one of the things that we actually love about Iceland. But a farmer, he did not love his lava field. So I was thinking, okay, when am I as a poet here and now? I was strolling around my neighborhood. I was born in a perfectly new suburb. That is, my parents built their house, my grandparents built their house, and most of the houses there are built in the 70s. So there was no history there. There was no story. There was no identity in the place. So I kind of was thinking about that. What does it mean to live in a land of history, but still living in a place without history or identity. And then I moved away from home, and I moved to a place that is close to one of the biggest strip malls in Iceland, and kind of one of the first places of modern kind of commerce, and the biggest parking lot in Iceland was close to my house. And I was thinking, wow, this is so ugly. There are not even seasons here. You know, how can I be a poet living here and not being inspired by glaciers and lava fields and not being downtown like a poet should be, but I'm just in this suburban ugliness. But then I thought, okay, maybe this is exactly my role. I'm a poet. I'm supposed to claim new lands, and when time changes, I'm supposed to bring that in. And so I was walking around this ugliest place in Iceland. It's called Skeivan. You should go there. Maybe you can take a tour there. And I went into, because I was a poor student, and I went into Bonus. I think all of you know Bonus. And I noticed that it had like bonus cola, bonus juice, bonus toilet paper, bonus everything. And I was thinking, how would a book of poetry look like if it was published by Bonus? So I designed the cover, and it looked like this. And I thought this was very tempting. It was like terribly ugly in a way, but beautifully ugly. And Bonus is actually, despite being a conglomerate, it is a local product. It is our bastard, like they say. It's not Kmart. It's not. So it's actually, from a foreign aspect, it's one of the things that are kind of special here. So I started to think deeper about this, and I was thinking like, okay, wow, this is not as unpoetic as it looks at first, because Bonus is divided exactly like the Divine Comedy by Dante. So you start in Paradiso, the fruit division, you go to Inferno, the meat products, and then you end in the Purgatory, the cleaning products. And then the poems, they just kind of started flowing, and I as a kind of a tasteless, almost tasteless literary prank, I started to make these bonus poems. And the poems, they didn't have names unless they were sponsored by multinational corporations. Man's primal instinct was not the hunting instinct. In ancient times, before man had spears and weapons, he roamed the prairies and he was gathering. He was gathering roots, and he was gathering fruits and eggs and nuts and self-dead animals. I, the modern man, I can feel how the primal man breaks forth as I race with the cart, and I gather and gather and gather. My grandfather was 70% water. He was 70% the stream that trickled past his farm. He was 30% the sheep that grazed on his mountain. He was the fish swimming in his lake. He was a cow eating in his field. He was the stream, he was the grass, the mountain, and the lake. I'm not 70% water, perhaps 15% mineral water. The rest is beer and Coca-Cola. I'm Italian pasta, Swiss cheese, Danish pork, and Chinese rice. American ketchup runs through my veins. You are what you eat. I'm a miniature of the world. No, I'm a miniature of Bonus.
So good.
So you could, because our body changes every element every 5 years. So if you shop in Bonus for 5 years, then everything you are came home in a yellow plastic bag and became you. So you could call it Mother Bonus, actually. This is beautiful in a way, or not. So I kind of finished this assembly and all the poems, and I strolled down to the head office of Bonus, and I showed them the cover, and they really liked the cover. So they published the book, and it was sold in Bonus on an eternal special offer by the counter. and it became a huge bestseller. It sold. You got one copy free if you bought 20 pounds of toy. So it was kind of a stunt. It was almost like some kind of visual art. Also, it was like the deal that I signed with Bonus was the same deal as the juice producer does. So I had to sign that because I had never done poetry, but I was like a subcontractor making poetry for them, and I signed the deal that if the consumer is harmed by the product, then they could sue the producer according to this and that law. So this was one of my first entries into the Icelandic literary world, and it was kind of a chance because I wasn't sure if people would get the joke, but the idea was to everything was taking tiny steps towards capitalism and sponsoring, and this was 1996, and things were kind of slowly going, and all your sports heroes and all your so they would have Pepsi on their chest, and your favorite singers like Britney Spears or something would also have some brands that they were promoting, and all my friends, they were studying something to hopefully work for something that produced something that would be sold in Bonus, or managing funds that would own something that would be sold in Bonus, and everybody was going into Bonus, but I was just supposed to be a poet, and I was supposed to frown upon this modern world, and I was thinking, why can't I sell out? So instead of asking them for sponsorships, why can't I just sell out? And if you look at the history of literature, all regimes, all ideologies have come with poetry. So we have the Skaldic poets, that would sail to Norway to praise the kings. You would have the church and the psalms. Then you would have the rise of the nations and the romantic poets and independence and praising democracy and these things. And then you would have social realism, where we were praising kind of the future of socialism. But I was thinking, then we live in this capitalist era, but it doesn't come with any poetry. So I was thinking, how does capitalist realism look like? Like poetry that gives confidence to the consumer, is loyal to the brands, and enhances economic growth. So that was this item of capitalist realism, of course, with some tongue in cheek. So this was an experiment, and the book sold a lot, and I was making fun of Bonus, but in the end, Bonus got lots of good credit. So I was, I got a call from the TV station. We had 2 TV stations, so I got a call from the other TV station. And this was at the time when half the nation watched one channel and the other half was watching the other. So you would reach like half the nation in 15 minutes. So they called me and they said, this was really cool. We were we were in Bonus all day, reading Bonus poetry, talking to consumers, talking to the owners, having people read poetry. So we're gonna air this tonight, like before the main news slot. So can you come to the studio and have an interview? And I was like, wow, I'm getting famous, And so I go to the studio, because they would never talk about poetry on TV. So this was like the first time I think they mentioned poetry on that TV station. So I went to the studio and they were putting makeup on me like they do in the back room, and on the woman next to me. And then the producer said, he was like, we just got a call from the editing room. They doubled the bonus slot, so we don't have time to talk to you. And pointed at the woman next to me. And she was from the Red Cross collecting money for refugees. And then they told me, so you're on air for 1 minute and you can talk about the bonus poetry, but you don't have time to talk about your short story collection, which was the book that I published simultaneously and was kind of my big ambition since I was 18 or something to make this my first big contribution to Icelandic literature. So it was this strange feeling that I was getting attention, but I was pushing aside something far more important. And I was thinking of this, was it Neil Postman, this entertaining ourselves to death. I was kind of feeling like I was part of that. And I was really thinking like, and so the book did very well and it sold a lot. And but I was thinking like, why am I writing? You know, like, and I was expecting a child at the time, and things were getting kind of strange in Iceland, and they were starting to kind of invade the highlands again, like for dams and aluminum smelters. So the peace that had been on the highlands since since my memory, so suddenly I was not satisfied with like where we were going as politically, and I felt like the society was getting weird. And I was working in the archives of the Andri Snær Magnason Institute. You know that institute where they keep the manuscripts. And I was in the basement, so I was putting on display Codex Regius every day, the poetic Edda, and which was, of course, I didn't know it I understood it at the time, but also in hindsight, it's almost unreal that I had the poetic Edda in my hands for a whole summer. And they were very bad at marketing, so they didn't let anybody know that it was on display. So basically, they just unlocked the doors and opened the doors, but they didn't talk to any tourist authorities or any marketing or anything. So I was alone with the poetic Edda for a whole summer and all the other manuscripts, while I was working on a CD. That is, there were like 2,000 hours of recordings in the basement of old women singing lullabies and rhymes and songs and hymns and old farmers telling stories. So you could Google almost, or not Google, you could search almost any farm in Iceland, and it's very likely that an old lady or an old man would be recorded there talking about, life, recordings from like 1903 to maybe 1970. When Iceland was changing maybe the most from this echoing of medieval society into being just flushed into the modern era. So I was listening to these old ladies, and I was astonished because I had never heard anything like it. I had gone through the whole school system, and I was studying Icelandic literature, and I had never heard the Rímur tradition. I just never heard it. They had never played throughout my whole kind of education, and I was very interested in Icelandic literature and all this, and I had never heard the chanting of Rímur, and actually how it was done or the aesthetics of this time. So I put these recordings on, and I just started laughing. I was like, what is this? And then I just started to gather more and more recordings, and I was letting my friends hear it, and I asked them to guess, where do you think this recording comes from? And they were like, Arabia, are these Native Americans? Is this something Chinese? But I said, no, this is from Bárðardalur, they were like, and it was so strange to see that how we had kind of cleaned up our past. So our past was like the Icelandic sagas, and then we had taken a few romantic poems and made proper songs to them, like Ríðum, Reykjavik. So, but like the Rímur was just like Brandin góma frastsöng hljóða brúði fróma gleðja þarsum róman stranga stóð stinu róma beðja. Like 50 verses of this, and which we were kind of learned to be kind of ashamed of. This was kind of hush. This was our unclean child. So I felt like okay, I could write something, but if I wanted to contribute something to our society and our kind of culture, it would be even more important just to give this back in its raw form. So I with with Rosa, was my coworker, we made this CD called Voices or Raddir, and we spent the whole summer of it on it. Now it's actually on Spotify, and it would be called the playlist, but it was that's how things are reduced to. So it was a very ambitious CD, and that inspired me a lot because I was just having this child, my oldest son, my oldest child, and I would play these recordings with these old women when he was uneasy, and he would stop crying immediately. so just naturally, I was like, oh, well, that's the old woman again, and I would play this like Grýlu kvæði, like 10 minutes of an old woman chanting about Grýla, and then I was listening to this and I was thinking like how culture had changed. So I was reading for my son like a thinned out version of Winnie the Pooh. So Winnie the Pooh, he caught a fish. It wasn't the real Winnie the Pooh, it was a thinned out version. So Winnie the Pooh, he caught a fish, and the fish looked at Winnie the Pooh and said, "Don't eat me, Winnie the Pooh." So Winnie the Pooh released the fish and roasted a hot dog instead. Because everybody knows a hot dog is not an animal. And the gory subtext of "Where's Piglet" was not comfortable either. So, and I was thinking of my memories of my grandfather and grandmother gnawing a seal fin, which looks like a human hand. It's like a sloppy human hand, and it's just a culture shock of their appetite. And then I was reading for my son like a thinned out version of Little Red Riding Hood. So Little Red Riding Hood went to a forest, and she came to her grandmother's house, and what do you think? The wolf had locked grandmother in the closet. And I was like, and then he locked Little Red Riding Hood also in the closet. And I was like, and then the hunter came and he said, "Shame on you, little bad wolf. You don't lock them in the closet." I said, "Oh, I'm sorry." And then they all had a cake. And I was like, wait. This is supposed to mess up my child psychologically. This is like one of the primal Freudian things that I'm supposed to install in my child, of devouring the cross-dressing wolf and the devouring grandmother, and then cutting up his belly and filling it with stones. And it's supposed to be a terrifying experience for my child to hear this story, like every generation before me, but not about locking them in a closet. And I was listening to these old ladies, and they were like singing these lullabies, and they were so dark, these dark fairy tales. It was like there was a child in the valley that fell into a hole, and in the hole there was a monster. The monster took the child and banged it on the ice, banged it once and banged it twice, and then each verse would be a body part flying off the child. and you would listen to this old woman, and she would be born like 1880, and she would be singing this, and she would be in her 90s when she was singing this, and you would hear how funny she thought it was when the body parts were flying up, and you would understand how fun it was to be her grandchild when your grandmother was terrifying you. But then she would give you cookies and cuddle you and close the evening with a nice prayer. And I was thinking, you know, if how literature was being thinned out while computer games and everything else was getting more and more brutal. And I was thinking, why are words so important while computer games and everything else is getting more and more disgusting, and then attracting, of course, their interest. So I wanted to write a children's book, kind of inspired by all of this, by telling jokes so nobody can hear, so nobody can think about Rwanda on TV or about my grandparents gnawing the seal fin, and also the promises of the government that they would destroy the greatest nesting place of pink-footed geese to bring us more happiness. So I wrote a children's book called The Story of the Blue Planet, which came out in 1999. So then I had suddenly made a book of poetry, and then a children's book, and short stories, and that book did very well, and it actually won the Icelandic Literary Award. So it was the first children's book to win the award, and I was by far the youngest person that had won the award. I was 26 when I won it. So and of course I had this peak anxiety, like okay, you've already topped. So my next book was not a children's book, but a book called Love Star, which is a sci-fi novel. And then the book after, kind of exploring the promises of the internet era of freeing us and giving us information, and looking at the more dystopian side of all that, of how that would be taken over. And it was sci-fi in 2002, but it's more like a modern parody now. This parody, contemporary parody now. So then I had, but then things were getting quite overwhelming here in Iceland. And actually, almost every other river, Aldeafoss. Have you seen Aldeafoss yet? Yeah. So Aldeafoss. Basically, every other waterfall in Iceland, or beautiful valley, or any water system in Iceland, was simultaneously being under attack. And I felt like, and especially the thing up east, also the greatest nesting place of pink-footed geese, and also Langisjór, which is a beautiful lake in the central Iceland. And I was just overwhelmed because I had gotten to know this beauty as a child, when my parents would take me into these highland interiors. And I felt like anything that I could write was completely worthless compared to the destruction that was going to happen. But I didn't have any background. I was just a student I was a poet, children's book writer. I was not an engineer, I was not a journalist, I was not an economist, but I felt like there was something deeply wrong in the whole discourse of how we are talking about things in Iceland, and how this really narrow approach that we have to build a dam to power the economy and create jobs. I just thought there was something deeply distorted, that I was like, really? So you're saying that if Alcoa says no, and no aluminum company wants to build a smelter in Iceland, that we won't have a future? Are you really thinking that? But it was so deep-rooted psychologically, this plundering and this kind of mentality of this boom mentality of that older generation, that when I was voicing against this, it was almost like I was we were kind of polarized, almost like America is now. Maybe not as bad, but it was like an issue like guns or whatever you have in America now. Like, it was an issue that was very important to address, but almost impossible to step into a polarized situation like this. But I think I felt also like the polarization was more like a very deep 15% and a very deep 15%, but there was a very big middle that actually just didn't want to dive into that discussion. So I started writing my book Dreamland, a self-help manual for a frightened nation, and the issue of dams was so unbearably boring. The language that was used was so stagnated. It was almost like nobody was thinking for themselves. You know, people were just throwing chunks of arguments against each other. And you could take these chunks and you could see that the whole paragraph was identical to a paragraph somebody else was throwing just a week before. And these horrible paragraphs were being thrown against each other. And it was just unbearably banal just to step into that. So I was thinking, what?
Concrete. Right?
Yeah, concrete. but also you could see that people did not think for themselves the arguments they were making. They were not original thoughts, they were just some kind of rhetorics, political rhetorics. So I thought, okay, I'm going to write a book, but I'm going to renew the language. I'm not going to use any of these rhetorics. So I'm going to actually also address these issues from a different perspective. So like the American Army the Navy wanted to close the base in Iceland. And everybody was like, you can't close down the base because 2,000 people were working in the base. But then I was like, but who's our enemy? You know, why is this base? And what's the strategy if we have an enemy? Then is it exactly this base that we need, or would we maybe need a different kind of base, or would we need 3 small bases? You know, is it exactly this Cold War base with 2,000 jobs that we need, or are we just kind of in this kind of colonized mentality? Just we want this to exist because this is what keeps us alive, but we're not taking responsible for our own fate. And so I kind of addressed the issue of the military base from almost like a Schumpeter creative destruction, like almost from not totally neoliberal, but more like this kind of startup mentality about that people. The premise is that people are talented, that people have choices, and that people in a kind of modern society can create things. That was the premise. So it's like, what happens if the base would just go away tomorrow? Okay, we have 200,000 square meters of space. You know, we have somebody that might have been the mechanic for the Air Force, but maybe he can become a mechanic for something else. Maybe you could have people living there. Maybe you could have a hotel. Maybe you could use facilities for something else. So I wrote a whole chapter that was kind of about the creativity of the Americans leaving. And so the book is about dams, but it didn't mention dams until page 200. And then I was kind of rewriting the history of Iceland and wondering, what if we said yes to all the bases that they actually invited us to build? That is, they wanted to build at least 4 or 5 bases in Iceland, and they would have employed almost the mass of available kind of workforce in Iceland. So in the 50s and the 60s. So if we had always seen ourselves as not having opportunities, not having choices, but had only one rule: job is holy. If somebody offers you a job, then you have to take the job. Then we would have had 5 military bases in Iceland, and we would probably have been poorer. We would have probably have had less advanced fisheries. We would probably have had a much lower education level, because the base would hire everybody in their 16, 17, 18s, and people would not have had incentives to educate. And then in the end of the Cold War, of course, Iceland would have been devastated, because suddenly the reason for Iceland would have been lost. So I was, of course, using that as a kind of a mirror for, okay, great, 5 aluminum companies want to build smelters in Iceland, super, but it's not our only possibility. But the problem was our mentality was like, okay, what is then our possibility? But you can't say that, because the future is never kind of defined in some kind of an engineered, concrete way. We grow into the future, we grow into possibilities, we grow into servicing or fixing needs, both in Iceland and abroad. But to serve maybe just one cause in the chain of the aluminum industry, or just the American, that is, by saying yes, it might make us weaker. And just like a few days ago, one of the biggest companies, so half the book is basically about, it's like asking a musician, so you're a musician, but what song are you making next year? Of course he can't say he's making a song next year, because he just knows he's creative and songs come. But we were in this impossible dilemma that I was asked maybe on TV, okay, you don't want the smelter, what should we do instead? Like that was a rational question. But a society isn't like that. Of course we need energy, and we had already fulfilled the need for energy, but this extra energy was not essentially what would make us richer. And I was arguing that in the end we could actually sacrifice not nature for the economy, but nature and the economy. So Dreamland came out in 2006, and that was a big changing point for myself. It sold like 23,000 copies, and because the book was about doing things differently, I asked my publisher, when is the worst time to publish a book? Because I'm arguing that we have to do things differently, so I have to practice what I'm preaching. When is the worst time to publish a book in Iceland? And because 90% of the book sales were like November, December, October, November, December. It was the Christmas book phase, and he said March is the worst time. I would never publish a book in March, and I pointed at the Excel sheet where the lowest sales were. I want to publish a book there, and it was actually so before Christmas it had sold 23,000 copies, much more than the crime novels or anything that had sold before. So that was kind of a whirlwind for me, and suddenly I had a very strange career of betraying my audience. That is, I did a poetry book, and when people wanted more poetry, I did a children's book. When people wanted another children's book, I did sci-fi, and when people wanted more sci-fi, I wrote about reality. And in some ways, avoiding to repeat myself, and also I think in hindsight, it's some kind of it makes sense in the term of crop rotation.
Mhm.
That is, it's good for a field to have barley, and then pumpkin, and then potatoes, and then just have the cows roaming free for a year. So my career has been kind of about that, and my latest book, which is on time and water. I'm kind of in the same dilemma, but on a more global scale. We have this issue called global warming, and we have these rhetorics. You know, I could almost have an AI machine write a book about global warming in 5 seconds. You know, we have to act now. This is our final decade to reduce emissions. You know, blah blah blah. You know, the rhetorics are almost unbearably the same, and then the denial is also in the same way. So the idea was, how do you write about something that is bigger than language? So I'm basically addressing the issue from there. So it's, what does it mean to be the first generation of humans that knows that they are melting glaciers? You know, what does it mean to be the first generation of humans that knows that we're raising sea levels? So if we look at the leaders of the world that went to Egypt for the last COP summit, Egypt was a very good setting, because that's kind of our longest memory goes down to Egypt. You know, when from the time of now down to the building of the pyramids, did we know that we could melt glaciers? You know, never. And we have mythology, of course, happening around Egypt. So for example, the Moses split the Red Sea, and we still remember that. It happened like 3,000 years ago, and the Red Sea was maybe 16 kilometers across, maybe 200 meters wide, maybe 100 meters deep on average. So Moses moved around maybe 1 cubic kilometer of water. That was considered quite an accomplishment, and but very temporarily. And it's still remembered now as a big thing. But the leaders that were meeting in Egypt, they were actually discussing how they are raising the global sea levels by 1 meter with either their active inaction, probably their active inaction, their inaction as an action. They are raising sea levels by 1 meter, and that's about 300,000 cubic kilometers of water. So if you say something is biblical, this is 300,000 times bigger than biblical. You have to go to the first pages of the Bible, to the Genesis. So God divided heaven and earth, or he separated the waters. Yes, he did that. But now we are merging the ice with the oceans. So we're closer to that scale. And then you go to like, so the idea is that mythology is actually makes sense to scale up size. How do you talk about something that is bigger than language? Mythology is actually suddenly a natural place to go to explain what is happening, because we are living some kind of mythology today. This will be remembered after 5,000 years. That is, if sea levels go up by 1, 2, 3 meters, it will be remembered after 5,000 years. And some iconic individual of today will be remembered as the person that looked upon it. Some tragic leader will have like this iconic status after 5,000 years. Like he had all these machines, all this know-how, all this knowledge, all these institutions, just all this excellence, satellites, complete information, and all this greatest intelligence humans had ever had, but they could not align their intelligence towards the cause, because the machines had their own will, and the machines were just doing their own things, despite the knowledge of the people. So in the end, humans that thought they were the most intelligent species of the planet, in the end behaved exactly like an algae bloom, just growing into the resources, just to fall back into some primal state. So the book is kind of acknowledging that the issue is larger than language. So my metaphor is the black hole. You can't look straight at the black hole. You have to look at the periphery, at the neighboring stars and galaxies. So what does it mean? What does 2100 mean? What does 2150 mean? Culturally, it's meaningless for us. I think most people of my generation think 1970 was 30 years ago. And 2100 has no cultural meaning for us. The year 2000 has a very strong cultural meaning, and such a strong meaning that I feel like it was almost harmful in its size, that we are kind of, when a scientist says 2050, we feel like it's after 50 years. And I think Gisli can probably find literature about this and argue if it makes sense or not. But I really think that we think 2050 is after 50 years. And if not, we actually know that 2100 is after 100 years. If we don't believe 2050 is after 50 years. So the idea is that the crisis is in the language, it's in how we sense time, it's in the scale of the change, it's in how time is in, how future is long, but past is short. So like the black hole. So I always go the opposite direction in my book. So to understand the future, to understand 2100, I go to my grandmother's house. And that was, she became 98, just to understand. So I thought, to connect to the future, I need to connect to the past in the same timeline. To understand science, I need mythology. To be rational, I need poetry. To be global, I need to be personal. So I always go the opposite directions from what would be expected. And I avoid all these rhetorics. I maybe don't even use the word climate change in the book, maybe once or twice. So when I told my friends I was writing about climate change, they were like, oh, boring. And I was like, how can the biggest thing in the world be boring? Why is that not like the only worthy literary challenge an author today has, or any individual? So then next time they asked me, what are you writing about? I said, I'm writing about time and water. And they were like, wow, that's interesting. What do you mean? Well, basically, in the next 100 years, all elements of water on the planet are going out of balance. The glaciers are melting, the oceans are rising, the pH level of the oceans are reaching a level not seen for 50 million years. All patterns of rain and snow, spring and summer, permafrost, basically ice caps, everything is simultaneously going out of balance, acting upon a lifetime of a single individual born today, becoming as old as grandmother. And they were like, "Whoa, shit, that's serious." I was like, "Yes, it's serious. It's sometimes called global warming." So I found that actually the author, the writer, does have a role. It's not about scientists producing papers, and but it's also about authors and people and art and scholars and taking this data and merging it with other data and actually asking, what does this mean in the large context? And so I got very good help from leading scientists in all of these fields, just to avoid kind of making any kind of scientific mistakes. But in the end, I found that the issue is very simple. You know, if I have to tell you how a car drives, you know, if you have to tell you to take a car from here to Sprengisandur, I don't have to tell you about the turbine and the brake system. You know, it's basically, in the end, things can be put in a quite a simple way. But and like just the fact, you know, is it mythological? So it means, like, in terms of ocean acidification, it means that a single human being is witnessing a greater change in the oceans than not only all the ancestors of Homo sapiens, if Homo sapiens is 300,000 years old, not all the ancestors of the Homo species, if the Homo is 5 million years old. We're talking about a single individual witnessing a bigger change in the world oceans than 10 times the evolution of humanity. And again, that is mythology. And that again asks me, do I write about that in exactly the language that humans created from 1995 to 2025? You know, is this the narrow rhetoric window? Or do I use, you know, is that exactly the language that encompassed? So I'm kind of aware that maybe exactly this language, which is also the language that is causing the destruction, is not appropriate. Maybe this language will be cancelled after 70 years as a language of where we kind of normalized the apocalypse and disregarded all future generations, you know, with our normalization. So my book is also about language and how long it can take for a new word to be understood. So I'm using examples of when we went from believing in the Nordic gods to being Christian, and the language was saturated with Nordic mythology. A poet did not say sky, he said the dwarf's helmet. He did not say earth, he said Odin's bride. And how do you talk about the creator of heaven and earth when language forces you to talk about the creator of the dwarf's helmet and Odin's bride? You know, so you could see how when a new idea comes in, you're still dragging along. When a new paradigm happens, there are transition times when you are between languages, when you're kind of between rhetorics, when you're between words or worlds. So in this case, you could not explain Christ without having the whole baggage of Nordic mythology with it. It's not like this today. So it took like 100 years to remove that baggage and create new words. So hey himna smiður, hey carpenter of the sky, or creator of the sky. So that's a new word where you can talk about God without using the dwarf's helmet. And then we become a democracy in 1800, a democracy, and the first time the words of democracy were mentioned in Iceland in 1809 was a peculiar event where some British soap merchants with a Danish translator locked up the local Danish authorities. And the Danish translator, he was like a very special character. He was like swimming in the waves of the French Revolution. So as soon as they locked up the local Danish leaders, he cooked up, he could cook up a declaration of independence. You know, that's just what you do. You know, like here's a nation that needs to remove a king. Here's a declaration of independence. So he had all the values, everything to put out in one day. But when people heard this in 1809, it sounded like nonsense. What do you mean that poor people, which were 95% of Icelanders, should have an equal share in the government as the rich and powerful? It's like, what kind of chaos is that? And what is a not king? So you mean we're not having a king, but then we're having an assembly, and this assembly is choosing a king. No, not a king, a not king. He's not a king. Okay, so you choose a not king, and then his son becomes a not king. No. Then they just change their mind and they decide somebody else is being the not king. Okay, by how? Oh, they just raise their hand. Then somebody else is not king. And then when they don't feel like him having not being a not king anymore, they raise their hand again and they decide somebody else is not king. So 95% of these people, these poor people that hardly can fend for themselves, are supposed to have not kings. You know, this will never work. This is just a crazy system. So the Icelandic language gives us very good insight into when an idea comes in, and also like, how does this parliament look like? You know, how do you dress? Where do you sit? Where's the parliament? What's the routine? You know, in what order do we walk in? Where do we sit? Do we have wigs? Do we not have wigs? You know what? Like, nobody had any kind of metaphor of what this was, and it took like 100 years until we became independent. And I'm mirroring that then into our times when all elements of water are going out of balance, and words like ocean acidification were created 10 years ago and have no cultural meaning. They're not like Holocaust. They're not like Hiroshima. They're not like they're not like the Beatles. They're not like anything. They're not just connected to anything. But it's the biggest word in the world, and we're currently living in an era where this word has been created, but it's culturally meaningless, and it's not connected to anything, and it's not either connected to the consequences of the word. That might eventually load it. So Time and Water is about grandmothers, glaciers, mythology, and I think my time is up, and I'm open to questions. Yeah.
That's amazing. Is it translated into English?
It's translated to 30 languages.
Excellent.
30.
Yeah, good, great, fantastic. The question of language is so huge, and so interesting, kind of talking about it and so forth, and it actually interferes with our theories of time to some degree, because of that way in which it sort of extracts itself or composes itself over time. And I'm just thinking of the word corporation when you were talking about the corporate, you know, becoming a corporation, a poet, or corporation, or whatever it is. It's incredible. And how the word corporation actually either emerges from or creates corporeal. So the body is in the corporation already, and then you extract the body in a certain sense, or the parts of the body from the word. And words are composed of body parts to some degree, often, and that's how we make abstract things like dance. You know, that there's in there somewhere is some kind of referent, and so I just think it, yeah, I mean, all of what you're saying about language is so interesting and not simple in a way, but and what occurred to me, and my just to make a remark, that our material construction operates in the same way. That, in other words, when you move from wood to iron, that iron has to look like wood for a while, so they pattern the iron like wood, and it takes a long time before iron develops its own sort of integrity and no longer has to look like wood. But and I think that's interesting that maybe the materiality of the world is also following that sort of, folding in for a period of time, or keeping things going from the pagan to the Christian. I mean, there's still paganism everywhere, and so it still flows through the time. So I just wanted to
That's interesting.
think about that. Yeah.
Cars still have to look like a horse carriage.
Yeah. And
100 years later.
warming climate has to look like what we think of as the former climate, or something like that. Yeah.
Where are you from?
New York.
New York.
I would just like to bow down to you as an independent thinker, because they're so terribly rare. And I read Vidar's excellent biography, Stefan Gay. And I'm just wondering if there's something about this place and about the culture, sensibility that allows or promotes that kind of independent thinking, because it is so terribly rare in the United States.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for the compliment. Well, I think Iceland actually has this size where you feel like you can do things. We might even have distorted feeling of scale. So you might imagine you could write a book where you could prevent glaciers from melting or something, which is a strange thing. I think there is. I could just say culturally in Iceland, like there is quite a lot of cultural activity, and I think it comes from. My theory is that it comes from. So we had these farms, and we had these long pouring winters. So not only survival was appreciated, but anybody that could make that survival bearable was also very appreciated. So culture and cultural figures were often kept alive because they kind of made every life bearable. And then when we become independent, and while we're kind of cleaning away this history of the old Rímur tradition that had been for 600 years, we have this ambition of being a nation among nations. That is not superior, but we want to be on par. We want to be able to have a symphony orchestra that is as good as the ones we see in the Nordic countries or Europe. We want to have a singer that can sing on Scala. We want to have a movie that is on a level that people abroad can see it and say, okay, that's a proper movie. Not the best movie in the world, but it looks like a real movie. And then we want to be able to have talents that can perform Shakespeare and Strindberg, and we want to be able to do the ABBA musical, and we want to have a black metal band and a death metal band, and then somebody saying, why is there no thrash metal in Iceland? So we are so incompetent. So somebody said, okay, I'll make a thrash metal band, and so it's kind of seeps down into things, and we want to have a university that represents most of these things, and then we have the language kind of as a kind of a over this all, and it creates this illusion of, you could say, illusion of success, that is, you can succeed here in Iceland in this tiny place, and you can. So somebody is like my friend. He was directing things in the biggest stages in Berlin and in Vienna. And somebody said, you know, you might be ready for the Icelandic National Theatre. And he was not kidding. So you know, he'd already been in much larger stages with a much deeper, thicker culture. And he was like almost ready for the Icelandic National Theatre. And actually, he was not considered having accomplished anything until he had performed something on the Icelandic National Theatre. And we had this guy that was, I think he was both the president of Sony and a best-selling author in Iceland. So he had an unfair share of talent. So he sometimes got unfavorable reviews in Icelandic papers. So he was maybe getting a good spread in the New York Times, but he was crying in his private jet because a tabloid in Iceland was giving him a skull for his book. So lots of people are leaving very sane societies, like stable, good weather, predictable wages, stable politics, leaving all that, a good job in a maybe nice hospital in Sweden or a nice company in Germany, moving to Iceland into the scruffy weather, because their children are maybe 12, and in a very strange way they feel like they're vanishing into something, but they're more existing when they contribute their lives to Iceland. It's a very Gisli has to tell you more about this, but I feel like this: people are leaving things because they want their children to continue to be able to talk with their grandparents, and there's just some continuation that is in there. And it's not a closed thing. That is like music and culture. It's not like saying you should write like the Icelandic science, but it's more like this openness. You're the next generation. You should be importing the influence, you know, translating the newest things from abroad into Iceland, and that makes us comfortable, but not this closed idea. So I would say that my career betraying my audience is quite possible here, while it might be more difficult elsewhere, where it would be more difficult to have the new start in a new genre. Yeah, that's my theory.
I totally agree with this, and I can add a little bit kind of historical roots of cultural creativity. You know, while the Reformation, the church monopolized the printed press until the late 18th century, until 1780 or something. But with the background in the medieval writing traditions, we had a very strong tradition of manuscript culture, endlessly reproducing, circulating, and creating something new that was circulating in manuscript between common people, high level of literacy, and so on and so on. And I sometimes describe this as a kind of self-defense against impossible conditions. So I think we can add this a little bit to what Andri was describing. And I think this background is one of the reasons why Icelanders were pretty quick to develop into a kind of hyper-modern society in the 20th century. More questions, comments?
You talked about how it takes a long time for linguistic conventions to change and have new baggage associated with them, new cultural meaning, but you don't use the words climate change or ocean acidification. Is there a doorway into cultural conventions that do get at what you're trying to describe that you're using?
No, I actually use the word ocean acidification very, very frequently.
Okay.
So deliberately, I'm using that very frequently. So acknowledging that I'm kind of installing a new word.
Yeah. How are you like adding a lot of cultural meaning to it, but there's no history.
Yeah, so that's just by writing it and telling you that you don't understand it, and telling you that the scientist that reads it doesn't understand it until, because we also mirror ourselves, because if the scientist was just running back and forth down at the university campus, like tearing his hair of anxiety, he would just be institutionalized. So he also kind of moderates his senses and aligns himself against society. And while we should be looking at him and freaking out because he's freaking out, he's been tempered down to some kind of moderate level. So it seems like sometimes the scientist doesn't understand it until we understand it. Sometimes once I met so these are words like so sometimes words open up a universe. So you could say like I know like Rebecca Solnit, she created mansplaining. I can tell you a lot about that word. No, I'm kidding. So she makes the word mansplaining. My sister asked me once what it was mansplaining. I was like, I can really tell you that. No, but this word was kind of it kind of disarms this normally older man that talks to a woman as a child, in some way. So it's a great word to disarm, and it just cracks something and cracks a connection, and changes the world in a way. It changes things. So you can, as soon as it happens, you can frame it. It's almost like surgically remove the problem because you can identify it with a word. But then we have words like climate change, and it's like it's the reverse. It's a word that almost feels like the whole universe and makes it invisible for you. So it's a word that should kind of open up and make everything visible and make and like unframe somebody, or like it should kind of frame somebody, or it should make more clarity, but in a way it's not. So that's why I'm not avoiding it in the book. It is in the book, but I'm going more like time and water. I'm like more, and I'm also going to the periodic table of language.
Please say more about that.
So we have the periodic table of elements, but it also feels like we have a periodic table of language. So it's like love, God, fire, tree, flower, eye, heart, soul, So, and that would be, you would find these words like in biblical and mythological and old texts. So like the biggest product of humans are emissions. What are emissions? So yes, there's CO2 emissions. 35 gigatons of CO2 emissions. All of these words are just fluff. 35 gigatons is fluff. It's just like, it's very, very much of something. Emissions. What are emissions? It's just emissions. Did God have emissions? Like did Thor have emissions? Like who emitted anything? So like emissions come from fire, and fire is in the periodic table of elements of language. So why am I using emissions? 35 gigatons of something invisible just becomes invisible, even though it is not. It's a very tangible, measurable, geological thing that is happening, but it vanishes into invisibility in our language. So if I go to the periodic table of language, I have emissions, but I don't find emissions, but I have fire. So, okay. And how much fire is behind 35 gigatons? we had the Eyjafjallajökull eruption. Volcano is in the periodic table of language. Maybe one of the first scary things that humans saw. So we had, and that eruption emitted about 150,000 tons of CO2 per day. Human emissions are about 100 million tons per day. So it means the fire that is behind our emissions are like 666 of these volcanoes. And if you talk to any geologist and ask them, when did we have 666 volcanoes of that size? Not temporarily for 2 weeks or a month, but for 50 years, just blowing simultaneously. It'd be like, well, there's this layer in the Grand Canyon where basically everything was fucked up, 50 million years ago. That's maybe the last time, or they would just say, I just don't recall any last time of that scale. And 666 is a beautiful poetic coincidence, but also in the periodic table of language.
I think Thor may have farted a lot, but Prison House of Language was a pretty well-known book title in the 1970s, 1972, I think, by Frederick Jameson. So Andri Snær is helping us escape this bloody prison, and we have to have lunch now. He will have a lunch with us. So let's give him a hand again. Thank you.